everybody was gearing up for elections, December this year, 2024. Suddenly they are no longer on the table for another 2 years. What has been your reaction, your response to this postponement?
The postponement was inevitable. The country was not ready for elections. And quite frankly, we were aware that of our most overriding concerns is that we should avoid a relapse into violence. And the academic literature is clear. Ill-prepared elections in a country which is emerging from conflict is an extremely dangerous situation to enter because you divide people precisely along the same lines that they have been engaged in physical violence. So it was clear to us that it would have been very ill-advised to proceed with the elections. Does that mean we were happy with the announcement? No, it wasn't. Because what had necessitated the delay was the failure to adequately prepare for the elections in the first place. And we would want to share that there was a considerable disappointment and regrets when the delay was announced because people feel trapped in an endless transition, bearing in mind that this was the fourth occasion in which the transition had been extended. So we needed to make the point that while we understood the underlying logic in postponing the election period and extending the transition by 2 years, we were unhappy with a further delay. We wanted to make it clear to the government that we didn't want to be in the same spot in 2 more years' time with the government still pleading that it needed more time or more resources to conduct the elections.
How did you see the mood on the ground among the citizenry and among international partners who have been striving, working hard to move the transition forward?
There was the mixed reaction of, well, the country was not ready for elections, but we need to point a finger at somebody to say, why are we not ready? Why has more not been done in the 2 years since the last extension of the transition? So I think South Sudanese wanted us to make that point, and we did.
And indeed, in the council today during the briefing, you had the South Sudanese activist and leader, Lorna Merekaji, gave a very dire indictment of the situation in South Sudan. And I quote her in her briefing to the Security Council. She said, "South Sudan is a sad story and on the brink of collapse." Do you agree with her?
No, I don't think it's on the brink of collapse. It's a sad story, but is it capable of addressing either the delay, the backlog, the aspirations of its people? Yes, they are capable. And we think with the additional time before elections, there is in fact a silver lining. What is that silver lining? It's because we're not there to run elections. We're there to build a democratic, stable society. Elections is one of the ways in which we do that. And the elections gives us an opportunity to engage in capacity building, allow South Sudanese to develop platforms for building their own democracy. Remember, this is not a UN project. This is a South Sudanese project. It's building on a peace agreement between South Sudanese and on the issues that they themselves agreed to in their peace negotiations. I would not go so far as to say that this is a task which South Sudanese cannot accomplish.
The vast majority of South Sudanese, over 75%, are facing acute food insecurity, according to the latest reports. We have floods, then we have conflict, and then we have certain situations of disease. How is the UN assisting the people of South Sudan in all these crises?
We are engaged supplying anti-cholera kits around the country to deal with the cholera outbreak, most of it coming from the north, from the conflict in Sudan. We have quite successfully, quite frankly, managed to contain the potential disastrous consequences of the floods, which is not to say we're out of the woods, But to say that the initial estimates of 3.3 million people being affected has now been downgraded to 1.5. And that's partly because of really effective relationship with host governments at local level and at national level in warning communities to seek higher ground in time. We also have probably, by the end of the year, upwards of 1 million of refugees from Sudan coming through, spilling over from that conflict. And when you take all that together, and of course the collapse in the pipeline that supplied over 70% of the fuel, you've got all the elements necessary for a perfect storm. And so the question is that we've had to be on our toes. And I think in regard to each of those issues, we are engaged, but we're engaged with South Sudanese.
You have mentioned the conflict in Khartoum, in Sudan, up north of South Sudan. What is the overall impact of this conflict on you and the team and your work in South Sudan?
The first and most obvious impact, of course, is the spillover of refugees from the conflict in Sudan. The current number is approximately between 500 and 700 a day, and we've been able to absorb them in along the Nile corridor from Malakal to Renk by largely integrating them into communities. Prices have rocketed. Inflation has affected the country quite significantly. We've got the outbreak of diseases, and we now have a plague of a particular kind of bird that is eating the sorghum maize. So there's almost no potential catastrophe which the South Sudanese are not facing.
What gives you the biggest cause for concern?
Consistently, the major cause for concern for us would be a reversion into civil war or a relapse into violence. The country's 2 civil wars in the past 10 years have left a devastating mark. Another civil war would be a catastrophe, not only for South Sudan, but for the region, which is already relatively fragile. There's conflict in Sudan itself. There's tensions between Somalia and Ethiopia over the Somaliland issues. The whole area could just simply not afford to have another conflict erupt. So that's one cause of concern. The other cause of concern in the longer term is that once again, the South Sudanese political leadership will fail to grasp this opportunity which has been given to them to prepare for elections and fail to implement the necessary preparations which would secure a credible, peaceful, free and fair election.
What is it that drives you? Because even before South Sudan became an independent nation, you were invested in the well-being of the people. Yeah. What gives you this sense of optimism?
Well, I think the greatest source of optimism are the South Sudanese themselves, and they've displayed a resilience and a commitment to staying the pace. Any country being asked to draft a new constitution, to devise a new set of rules for an election and to conduct an election, to conduct a voter registration exercise, to conduct a census, all within the next 2 years. It would be a stretch even for a developed country. We think they can do it. We are stressing that it's important for South Sudanese to put some of their own money into this process and not just leave it to foreigners. But we're also reassuring them that we believe the international community would be more forthcoming if they could see evidence of the political will on the part of the leaders which would justify their faith in Project South Sudan.